Marcusian Politics Today, the abstract written by Javier Sethness, I'll read now. Herbert Marcuse's political philosophy, understood as libertarian Marxist critical theory, has helped multiple generations of radicals to interpret, elucidate, and support emancipatory, nonconformist movements. In this sense, when considered today, Marcuse's views on politics, rationality, eros, and revolution can help illuminate various forms of oppression and repression instituted by different societies, states, and hegemonic cultures across the globe. Marcuse's political and psychosocial insights highlight various forms of resistance against the repressive reality principle that rules contemporary society, together with paths to liberation at both the individual and collective levels. As we have seen over the past year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic has lit up the political, economic, cultural, and ecological contradictions of capitalism as a thanatonic system. Thus, this roundtable will concentrate on how Marcusian politics can be reconstructed in 2021. We will respond to the question, what critical insights might Marcusian approaches provide us into interpreting the changing world today? We've got three presentations. One from Shon Meckfessel, Anti-Humanism on the left. One from Javier Sethness, A Critical Theory of Authority, and Rocío Lopez, Fascism as Bourgeois Reaction. I think our plan is to begin with Shon. Is that okay? Okay, let me just read a brief statement regarding Shon in the presentation. Shon Meckfessel has been active in disruptive social movements for about 30 years, beginning in Sacramento, California. After blocking highways to stop the first Persian Gulf War, he was never again inclined to petitionary protest. He has since researched and participated in social movements across the US, Western and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. Shon is the author of Suffolk Howard Gush, North American Anarchist in the Balkans, Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be, as well as numerous essays and articles. He is a member of the English faculty at Highland College. Today, as in the past, the most promising left-wing movements have defied the ways of the old world by proclaiming freedom, solidarity, and equality. At the same time, there has been long, fierce debate about the relationship between liberalism and the left. Is revolutionary leftism the logical progression of the rationalist and humanist principles set forth by the Enlightenment and the liberal legacy, which cannot complete their missions? Or are leftism and liberalism mortal enemies? In this presentation, Shon will compare what Theodore Adorno calls bourgeois coldness with the tactical and strategic ruthlessness of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and examine how such authoritarianism has impacted US American culture and politics, especially the New Left and the Black Power movements. So thank you, Shon. Look forward to the presentation. You're up.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to the conference and thank you to my co-presenters. I realized hearing the proposal that my initial ideas were pretty ambitious, so I'm not going to be covering anywhere near all the ground that I wanted to in the proposal. But I guess what I'm going to be focusing on my talk, I think all three of us are kind of really looking at contemporary US politics as illuminated by maybe contemporaries of Marcuse, people that he was in conversation with, and thinking about ways that maybe Marcuse, at least opening the conversation for ways that Marcusian thought might lead us out of some of the impasses that we found ourselves in the contemporary situation, particularly in the US. So my part of this I'm going to be looking at is, and again, I apologize that this is kind of undeveloped. This is really the beginning of a sort of research program for me. Previously, my last book that I wrote was a critique of nonviolence in the US and the ways that I think there's a certain ossification that happened around the ideas of nonviolence in the early 70s, having to do with the specific material conditions and social conditions that were occurring, at that time, and that we've kind of we're still using the same vocabulary, the same terminology, the same rhetoric, even though our conditions are very, very different. And so that was, I wrote an entire book on this. I'm happy to talk about that, but that was my previous research. I'm now getting kind of more interested in the way that that same problem is true in terms of this ossified vocabulary around that issue of nonviolence and violence, but I'm kind of more interested in the violence end. And particularly, I've been drawn, I recently traveled through China. I've been doing a lot of, I'm kind of engaged with the Chinese left communist journal, Chuang, which I heartily recommend. And I'm really interested in the ways that the misrecognition and misremembering of the Chinese Great Proletarian Revolution from 1966 to 1976 has influenced the outlook of the left, which, you know, it was very clear at the time during the New Left that that was occurring. And I think also a lot of those bad habits and impasses of thought have been inherited by the contemporary left, and we're still struggling to kind of get out of those. So that's my focus in this talk. And again, it's such a broad topic, even this, that I apologize. It's sort of broad sways. I feel a little bit like I'm kind of launching an ex homonym on the left for its inherent Maoism, and I'm not going to have time in this panel to really unpack a lot of the claims that I make. But I do kind of want to open a conversation about how the genealogy of a lot of our current limitations that we're stuck in the left dates back to the New Left's misrecognition of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So and also I'm interested, again, I'm not a Marcuse scholar by any stretch, but I'm kind of, I wanted to open this up in this conference to sort of get feedback in the Q&A section from Marcusians about ways that Marcuse might offer us a way out. So one quote that really shows this issue that I'm talking about with the kind of misrecognition of the Cultural Revolution that I like to start with is from one of the manifestos of the Weather Underground. And they, let me pull this up. They were seeking in the manifesto to identify themselves, to show where their values were, and they identified with their movement as, quote, akin to the Red Guard in China, the Red Guard being the groups that were enacting the Cultural Revolution. Based on the, so this again, back to the Weather Underground. We are akin to the Red Guard in China, based on the full participation and involvement of masses of people in the practice of making revolution, a movement with a full willingness to participate in the violent and illegal struggle, unquote. So this quote is really telling because, I mean, first of all, what the Cultural Revolution was in a word is that after Mao's catastrophic missteps in the Great Leap Forward, which resulted, you know, in the starvations of tens of millions of people, tens of millions of deaths, he had fallen out of favor within the Communist Party, and he was becoming weakened in position, and people weren't really listening to him. But he still had this phenomenal charisma and status with the masses of people in China, because of still being seen as the sort of human manifestation of the Chinese Revolution. You know, who's sort of worshipped as kind of almost a godhead. There was a cult of personality around him. So what he did was he used, sort of as we've seen with Trump, he used this direct appeal to the masses, and especially the youth, to urge them. He said basically that the capitalist roaders were taking over the party and taking over China. And so he urged the youth of the country to rise up against the party, against the state in some sense, and to attack the bastions. And he said it's right to rebel. And he was saying all these rebellious terminologies, encouraging young people in particular to attack the bureaucratic aspects of the party, which were limiting his reach. And so it's odd to think of that as illegal in the Weather Underground sense, because it was a state-sponsored, state-led movement, top down, and it was for the purposes of battling within power of different factions within the Communist Party. So, I mean, it was certainly against state institutions in some sense, but it was no more illegal than, say, Trump kind of, you know, defunding the EPA or something. And, you know, the other thing that really strikes me as delusional about this quotation is to talk about the Cultural Revolution as emblematic of a full mass participation of the people is just lunacy, because well, it was really more than anything a civil war. Within a few years, particularly within the first several years, millions of the numbers are still fought over, but as many as a million people were killed, and without doubt, tens of millions of people's lives were destroyed. There was mass suicides as a result of these public humiliation campaigns. It was really catastrophic. And the logic of the Cultural Revolution was anything but unified. You had these sort of social sectors rise up and grab a hold of Mao's rhetoric and use it as an excuse to do violence against another social sector that they were in tension with, or just individuals. And then, within a month, the people who were attacked, the group that was attacked the first time around, would take the same rhetoric, would take the same slogans, and attack the first people, saying the same thing, calling themselves Red Guard. So it was, if anything, an example of phenomenal disunity, and that's how it's remembered to the degree that it is remembered in China. It's not remembered as a moment of popular uprising, but the New Left was really kind of saw it as an example, and I think Javier has actually helped me see this. Marcuse himself shared this problem, that they saw it as an example of a youth-led, kind of like student movement and power that overcame some of the limitations of the Soviet model while still embracing socialism, and so it had this big influence that maybe, in some sense, I think it was this basically Orientalist reading, kind of racist Orientalist reading of what was happening in China, because people were just sort of like, oh, the wise Chinese, Mao, and they were really not very interested in engaging the particularities of what were happening. To be fair, it was also, they didn't have Twitter. It was probably hard to get reliable information, and of course, people were justifiably suspicious about the portrayal of the events in China through the bourgeois press, but they were still sort of like the Moscow trials of a generation earlier. They were reluctant to notice what was actually happening. So what? I think one of the legacies, I have 4 legacies I'm going to try to get through that I think we have to still come to terms with of this misrecognition. For one is, as I said, I've been very interested in this ossification of the debate between nonviolence and violence. And I have my entire research for several years was criticizing nonviolence proponents for having this sort of magical idea of nonviolence, looking back at MLK and Gandhi, but not at the circumstances and the particular mechanisms that they enacted under the name of nonviolence to be effective. They just sort of, people try to kind of evoke magically the power of nonviolence without actually making it effective, without doing the things you have to do for those things to work. I think Mao, Mao himself was a strategic genius. That's how he rose to power, as his role as a military leader in the Chinese Revolution, culminating in 1949. But as a sort of global spokesman for the revolutionary left, the way he talked about violence was liable to be taken up in a very unstrategic way. He, of course, is endlessly quoted by talking about how political power grows from the barrel of a gun. That became, a leading slogan of the Panthers, of a lot of factions of the New Left. He also, there's a quote here that, in speaking of the Chinese Revolution, he said, "In the face of our enemies, of such enemies, the Chinese Revolution cannot be other than protracted and ruthless. In the face of such enemies, the principal means or form of the Chinese Revolution must be armed struggle." So again, I think within the context, talking about Chiang Kai-shek and the conditions they were facing, I can see why he said that. He had a point. But this romanticization of this, extolling ruthlessness kind of on its own terms and equating transformation with armed struggle became mapped much more broadly. And just, my way of understanding it is, for a lot of the New Left, and a lot of, this is not just in the US, this is also maybe the RAF and the Brigada Rosa, and a lot of these Maoist influenced guerrilla movements across the West, it was almost like they moved from political power grows out of the barrel of a gun to, if you have stuff coming out of your gun, that means you have political power, which is obviously not the same thing. But it was an equation that was easily mistaken. And similarly, the sort of valuation of ruthlessness as somehow enacting social transformation continues, I think, in a tradition of the sort of hard-headed revolutionary left that's not going to be dissuaded by illiberal concerns. So yeah, there's a lot to say on that, but I think that's one of the starting points. actually, if I can share, my first book that I wrote was actually about my time living on and off for a decade in the Balkans. And, you know, for a stretch of time, Mao's only ally in the world was Enver Hoxha in Albania. And if I think about this magical thinking around violence, the image that comes to mind is Enver Hoxha's bunkers. There's like 200,000 bunkers in Albania. That's one for every 10 people. And Hoxha was saying this is proof that we're an anti-imperialist power. If anybody ever tries to invade us, every citizen will be like in a bunker with a AK-47. The problem is, like, you know, by the time he was building these, pretty much any state in the world can just like run a tank over the bunker and bomb it. And it's not very useful for actually fighting the specific particular struggles that they're likely to face. But this performative readiness for violence was really key to his politics. Also, it kept everybody exhausted. There's some brilliant, Ismail Kadare, the Albanian writer, has a brilliant book called The Pyramids about this. So to touch on, I don't have enough time to go into great depth with the other factors, but I think Maoism has also had a detrimental influence on our thinking by this kind of claim to objectivity and a hostility to subjectivity. And I think particularly when we look at Marcuse, this is something that, you know, we could use a Marcusean influence to undo within the left. Marcuse provides us with wonderful tools that are still very relevant for criticizing this. You know, shortly after Mao rose to power, he publicized an extremely complex categorization scheme that reminds me of, you know, the British racial mappings of like 200, you know, admixtures of race. You know, whatever. Mao published this to differentiate people's class standing, and this was used by the state. This was used as a class systematizing method by the state for generations to determine somebody's class status. So class became not so much somebody's current position with relation to the means of production, as of course Marx would have it, but it became like a family inheritance. There was even a thing called bloodline theory that was very popular in the first years of the Cultural Revolution, where people were saying that, like, their, you know, if their father had been a peasant, that made them an automatic revolutionary. We don't have that version of it in the contemporary left, but I think the analogy with a kind of reductionist identity politics, not, you know, I'm not speaking of critiques of racism, that has to be central to, given how power works in the US, but this idea of the sort of inherited radicalism from your ancestors, and like that anybody of a certain demographic is like automatically speaks like from the fount of the revolutionary struggle of their ancestors, regardless of what they actually are doing in their lives and their position with institutions and different kinds of power. I think that's a bad habit that we've had to outlive, that we've yet to outlive, yet to fully find a way into criticizing. And a lot of it goes back to those Cultural Revolution influences. Also, by the way, the sort of white privilege confessionalism. I live in Seattle, in the same city that Robin DiAngelo is very successful in writing her books like White Fragility. And this kind of like performative confessionalism of how awkward, you know, how bad you feel, and putting everybody in the room in this cringe-a-thon is very much like a Cultural Revolution continuation of the practice of self-criticism. We even still sometimes use the term self-criticism as if that you're embracing and public performance of shame about your subjective position is somehow a means of undoing it historically, regardless of what you're doing in, you know, that active reproduction of systems of power. So these lead me into what a lot of people, for example, Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air is a brilliant analysis of the strengths and weaknesses and the life of the new communist movement in the New Left. And he says in his end of this grand work that Maoism was the most destructive tendency within the new communist movement. And the single worst thing about it was this line that, again, the New Left in the West took from the Cultural Revolution that was, Mao said, and it was repeated ad nauseum, the correctness or incorrectness of the ideological and political line determines everything. And so that becoming a founding mechanism, founding idea among, you know, purported Marxists is really remarkable if we pause to think of it. Marx, if anything, kind of defined his thought as Hegel on its head, that you look towards material conditions, material processes, material realities, you always come back to them, and you look at the, the world as it is, and it's through those processes that we can have agency and that we can have liberation, but you can never lose touch with the material world. And if anything, I think, Mao's claim here has said exactly the opposite. It's also, obviously this very kind of puritanical outlook about thought and about debate. And this was also accompanied in practice by Mao claiming what he called the two-line struggle, which was inside the Communist Party. He said that any difference of ideas, out of any difference ideas, one of them would end up a proletarian idea, and one of them would be revealed as a secretly bourgeois idea. And so seeing a difference of opinion framed in terms of essentially treason and betrayal, I think has, in China, in times of the Cultural Revolution, that now is this thing of great regret, but maybe not so much in the left that's looked at it, is this endemic habit that can really, that leads to sectarianism, leads to Puritanism, and leads to a complete disinterest in actually orchestrating transformations in the material sphere, which, if anything, that's what Marxism should be for. The last thing I want to talk about as I wrap up my time is the influence of Maoist idea of anti-imperialism. And what happened was, the Chinese Revolution and the New Left, at the second generation of the Chinese Revolution, and then the New Left were coming to be in this time when, of course, in the wake of World War II, European colonialism around the world was crumbling. And obviously a beautiful thing. And obviously it's understandable that somebody preoccupied with human egalitarian establishment for human conditions and with liberation would espouse this process, right? And Mao, in some sense, sincerely and in some sense opportunistically, tried to situate China and the Chinese Revolution and himself as a leader as at the forefront of this global wave of anti-imperialism between the two, between the first world of US power and the second world of Soviet power. He was one of the big proponents of third worldism, with China and himself, with China at the helm of global anti-imperialist revolution and himself the helmsman. The issue with this is he lost a lot of the subtlety that previous Marxist thinkers like Fanon, for example, had in realizing that there's a complicated, there's moments when perhaps leftists need to embrace national liberation struggles, need to even engage in cross-class collaborations in order to overthrow imperial powers. There's times also when you might not, and there's a complication to collaborating with social sectors that might end up your opponent or might already be your opponent in some parts of your struggle and not in others. So what comes to mind, my partner and I made a documentary at one point in Lebanon. We were interviewing a socialist group in Lebanon, and they were saying, why in Lebanon, why across the Middle East are we not allowed to have class struggle? Why do we only get to have the priority of anti-imperialism? Why is it that, if we object to our internal warlord capitalist class in Lebanon, people say that we're distracting from the only real issue, which is, US and Israeli imperialism. Obviously, they're not discounting the centrality of the oppression of the situation with Israel and of the US influence on that, but it's not the only thing that affects their lives. And they're like, why are we not allowed as leftists to criticize this in an intersectional sort of Marxist analysis? Again, I think that blindness towards the substituting of anti-imperialism for a class struggle analysis, the thought that you can kind of sweep aside conversation with one with merely geopolitical issues on the other and not engage in the complications of that is a bad habit we've inherited from Marxism. And particularly we see it today manifest in, I think magnified by the effect of social media, but manifest in a very broad spread kind of deductive geopolitical alliances that you find with a lot of the left embracing current Communist Party of China policies around the genocide in Xinjiang of Uyghurs, or supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria, or Ortega in Nicaragua, you name it, all these oppressive regimes, just because they're not seen as like the US side of things, which is often not even the accurate view, are worth supporting merely because of this sort of risk the board game view of global politics, and with no concern whatsoever with having solidarity with class struggles within the countries they're speaking of. So that wraps up my time with this, but I'll be really looking forward in the question and answer period to hear ways that Marcusean thought might help us get out of some of these impasses that we've ended up in from this kind of anti-humanist strain of Maoism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to hear from Javier Sethness next. The paper is a critical theory of authority. Javier Sethness is a primary care provider and the author and editor of 4 volumes, including Eros and Revolution, The Critical Philosophy of Herbert Marcuse, and Imperiled Life, Revolution Against Climate Catastrophe. In his 1936 study on authority, Herbert Marcuse writes, quote, "The recognition of authority as a basic force of social praxis attacks the very roots of human freedom," end quote. At the most basic level, authority is based on voluntary obedience, as Etienne de la Boétie and Jean-Paul Sartre knew. Likewise, Sigmund Freud and the critical theorists highlighted the internal dynamism of oppression. In this sense, the withdrawal of obedience and consent could result in social change and a different future. At the same time, not all revolt is emancipatory. In this presentation, Javier will analyze the, quote, reactionary rebellion, end quote, of the revolutionary French syndicalist Georges Sorel, follower of Proudhon and mentor to Benito Mussolini, and the bureaucratic anti-humanism of Louis Althusser, who rejected the May 1968 uprising. He will then conclude with an analysis of national socialist currents on the left today and offer some reconstructive comments. The floor is yours, Javier. Thank you.
All right, so thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the organizers of the conference. And thanks to my co-panelists. It's really been a great experience so far. And I hope we continue to have a good experience. So, in Character and Social Structure, the Psychology of Social Institutions, the sociologists Hans Gerth and C. Wright Mills observe that, quote, "From a psychological point of view, the crux of the problem of power rests in understanding the origin, constitution, and maintenance of voluntary obedience," end quote. They add that, quote, "Authority or legitimated power involves voluntary obedience based on some idea which the obedient holds of the powerful or of his position." Indeed, end quote. Indeed, in his discourse on voluntary servitude, Etienne de la Boétie came to much the same conclusion, namely that authority persists because we allow it to. Although the reproduction of hierarchy under capitalism is not so simple as that, considering the threats of unemployment, imprisonment, starvation, and assassination for those who rebel, there is something to Jean-Paul Sartre's comment about a kind of, quote, complicity between the oppressor and the oppressed, end quote. In turn, the models of sexual sadomasochism and socio-political authoritarianism developed in the 20th and 21st centuries by Sigmund Freud, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Jessica Benjamin, and Lynn Chancellor highlight the psychodynamic dimensions of erotic frustration and gender and class oppression. In other words, under generalized relations of dependence on capital and male authority, the power of the boss, man, sadist, and/or top is ultimately derived from the psychological self-subordination of the worker, woman, masochist, and/or bottom. In this sense, the specter of revolt can function as a destituent power that reverberates throughout society. At the same time, not all revolt is emancipatory, and I quote Jacques Rancière, "There is no theory of subversion that cannot also serve the cause of oppression," end quote. In Reason and Revolution, Marcuse controversially defends Hegel's criticism of the pseudo-democratic opponents of the post-Napoleonic restoration regime, likening them in their xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and German nationalism to precursors of the Nazis. Along similar lines, Ziemf Sternhol sees the fascist cultural and political revolt against Enlightenment values like humanism and rationalism not as anomalous to European history, but rather as integral to it. The anarcho-syndicalist Rudolf Rocker likewise saw in fascism, quote, a reaction to progress rooted in German history, but concerning the whole of Europe, end quote. We might add the whole of the world. Unfortunately, as was confirmed not only by the descent of the Russian Revolution into a Stalinist nightmare, but also by the collaboration of revolutionary syndicalists in the birth of National Socialism, the phenomenon of the leftist right, or what Jürgen Habermas termed a left fascism, quote unquote, certainly exists. Both in the past as in the present, we see, quote, discourses of order composed in the vocabulary of subversion, end quote. We can see two examples of this dynamic in the gray zone bloggers, I'll return to them in my conclusion, as well as the Trumpist coup that was attempted at the Capitol in January of this year. So in this presentation, as Andy said, I'll analyze the reactionary rebellion of George Sorel, who was a follower of Proudhon, mentor to Benito Mussolini, who, as we know, was the first fascist leader who inspired Hitler's 1923 Deer Hall push, and also examine Louis Althusser's reaction to the May 1968 uprising. Okay, so to George Sorel. Perhaps ironically, George Sorel, who infamously synthesized revolutionary syndicalism with ultranationalism to inspire fascism, shared some concerns with the anti-fascist Marxists of the Institute for Social Research, otherwise known as the Frankfurt School. They commonly focused on symbols, emotions, and socio-political psychology in their respective intellectual projects, although admittedly, for vastly different reasons. Sorel sought to, quote, mobilize the masses and to change the world, end quote, by annihilating bourgeois society while upholding the authority principle and the place of revolutionary elites, whereas the critical theorists aimed at a non-repressive, anti-authoritarian transformation of global society. Across different generations, both the Frankfurters and the Sorelians worried that the working classes of advanced industrial societies had been integrated into capitalism. Sorel despaired that the French Confédération Générale du Travail was more interested in reform than revolution, and Marcuse wrote One-Dimensional Man under the impression that workers in the US would not rise up against capitalism. Along similar lines, Sorel and Walter Benjamin shared a belief in the heroic potential of pessimism. Of course, neither Adorno nor Marcuse, much less Benjamin, turned, as Sorel and Martin Heidegger did, to National Socialism as a quote-unquote new revolutionary path. Rather, as German Jewish Marxists, they were forced to flee Nazi Germany and relocate to New York as refugees. After scaling the Pyrenees Mountains in late September 1940, Benjamin poignantly lost his life in the Spanish border town of Portbou, where he overdosed on morphine rather than be deported to by Franco's guards to the Nazi collaborating Vichy regime. In the US, their newfound home, the surviving critical theorists continued their principled anti-authoritarian analysis of society, rather than betray the cause, as Sorel so egregiously did. According to Sternhol's account in The Birth of Fascist Ideology, fascism can be interpreted as a revolt against the principles of the Enlightenment. Certainly, this thesis can explain Heidegger's own attraction to and promotion of Nazism. Like his intellectual mentor Friedrich Nietzsche, Heidegger sought to demolish the, quote, post-1789 moral political dispensation and replace it with a new, radically illiberal and anti-egalitarian dispensation, end quote. In Reason and Revolution, Marcuse analyzes the counter-Enlightenment philosophers who rejected German idealism and inspired Nazism. In this sense, he highlights F.J. Stahl, who affirmed anti-rationalism, repudiated natural law, and sought to replace the category of reason with obedience. Likewise, Sorel. In Sternhol's view, quote, a horror of the Enlightenment was basic to his thinking, end quote. Indeed, this devout Catholic had no truck with the anti-clerical cause. As a white supremacist, Sorel condemned what he saw as the Jacobins' quote-unquote recklessness for abruptly abolishing slavery in the colonies, end quote, particularly in Haiti. Many of his followers encouraged Italy's invasions of Libya and Ethiopia as labor imperialist projects. Like his protege and fellow revolutionary syndicalist Mussolini, Sorel found Nietzsche's ideas attractive, especially the philosopher's contempt for English ideas, liberalism, and bourgeois society. As Marcuse analyzes in a study on authority, Sorel attacked the idealist tradition while hailing proletarian violence as a new form of authority. Like Stahl, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, Sorel rejected rationalism, humanism, and natural law. His infamous quote-unquote revision of Marxism involved advocacy of the destruction of liberal democracy and parliamentary socialism through class struggle. Paradoxically, like Proudhon, Sorel, quote, refused to touch private property and believed neither in equality nor in social justice, end quote. In reality, this anti-democratic socialist envisioned the creation of what Sternhell calls a producer's civilization, which would effectively function as a, quote, revolutionary capitalism or a capitalism of producers, end quote. As such, it is not hard to see how such a vision of stripping away liberal norms while retaining the capitalist mode of production could morph into Mussolini's class collaborationist corporatist strategy. In this sense, the birthplace of fascism was neither Italy nor Germany, but rather France. Though Mussolini would not seize power until 1922, Sternhell argues that all the requisite conditions for the propagation of the fascist ideal were in place before the outbreak of World War I. In the years after the publication of his Reflections on Violence, 1908, a volume that exhorted the proletariat to wield violence to annihilate the bourgeoisie, Sorel abandoned socialism in favor of ultranationalism and the so-called conservative revolution. In turn, Sorel inspired the founding of the national syndicalist Cercle Proudhon in late 1911 as a clearinghouse for quote-unquote nationalists and leftist anti-democrats. The futurists and Sorelians in this circle highlighted Proudhon's defense of private property, militarism, traditionalism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. As champions of anti-rationalism, anti-humanism, pessimism, a hatred of democracy, and fidelity to Sorel's masculinist cult of violence, these left-right syncretists proclaimed their ideal, quote-unquote, the non-proletarian revolution, the national revolution. As Marcuse might say, the Sorelians failed to question, much less overcome, technical reason. Instead, they inspired Mussolini and Hitler to build on Sorel's vision of a future wherein the cult of energy and authority would emerge victorious all along the line. Crucially, Sternhell distinguishes between the theoreticians of revolutionary syndicalism and anarchism. For Sorel and his followers, quote, the principle of authority was never in question, end quote. In fact, Edward Berth, his right-hand man, wrote that, quote, a real abyss divided the ideas of the syndicalists from those of the anarchists, end quote. Paradoxically, the Sorelians opposed the concept of self-management, whether individual or collective. Effectively, they proposed a hierarchical and productivist society run by syndicates. Ultimately, these revolutionary unionists were just used by the fascists to seize power. After all, national syndicalism and corporatism utterly contradict the cause of worker autonomy. As we know from Franz Neumann's Behemoth, the Nazi regime was run in the interests of the industrialists, the bureaucracy, the military leaders, and the National Socialist Party. Even so, the case of Sorel is a disturbing one, considering how it illuminates the overlap between left and right, which are categories that are often considered to be mutually exclusive. How can it be that Jacques Rancière describes Sorel, perhaps unfairly, as an anarcho-syndicalist? That Mussolini and the Sorelian Georges Vallon had anarchist sympathies before embracing National Socialism, and that so many Italian revolutionary syndicalists became fascists. In reality, many leftists and fascists commonly emphasize direct action, energy, violence, heroism, and sacrifice, while championing the will to power and conquest, and critiquing moralism. Mussolini and the Nazis admired Bolshevik authoritarianism, and Stalin trusted Hitler, trusted and allied with him. So part of the appeal of Sorelianism to syndicalists and nationalists alike was, and remains, its claim that both groups shared common enemies in liberalism and parliamentarism. Especially in the wake of postmodernism, many self-proclaimed leftists share a reactionary commitment to anti-universalism. Whether a century ago or now, it is apparent that Sorelians, neo-Stalinists, and National Socialists merely seek the worst of all possible worlds, that is to say, capitalism without any rights at all. Moving on to Althusser. In Althusser's lesson, the French philosopher Jacques Rancière takes his former professor to task for siding with the Communist Party of France, which opposed the revolutionary student movement of May 1968 as quote-unquote petit bourgeois. In regurgitating the party line, Althusser effectively defended the division between mental and manual labor, privileging the former over the latter, while affirming the quote-unquote very model prescribed by the philosophy of educators, that is, enlightened despotism. Besides Althusser's disgrace, Rancière's volume is focused, quote, on the much broader logic by which subversive thoughts are recuperated for the service of order, end quote. Broadly speaking, for Rancière, Althusser's career amounted to what he calls, and I quote, the fight of a communist philosopher against that which threatens both the authority of his party and of his philosophy, namely cultural revolution on a global scale, end quote. Both Althusser and the PCF leadership were anxious about the discovery of Marx's economic philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which so moved from Marcuse, Raya Dunayevskaya, and others, because they feared the creation of a political authority other than the party. In terms of theory, Althusser insisted that, quote unquote, Marxism is an anti-humanism, and he proposed instead that humanism is bourgeois idealism, while championing Marxist-Leninist orthodoxies through his promotion of, quote, an unofficial version of Stalinism, end quote. Indeed, by the time the May 1968 uprising began with student revolt, Althusser had long given up on any ideas he might have had about questioning or dissolving state power, factory despotism, or wage labor. His attacks on the syndicalist left and his disgrace over May 1968 speak for themselves. Some of the reconstructed proposals that Rancière considers in closing are ideas about proletarian humanism, self-management, and the independence of labor. Conclusion. Returning to the attempted capital push of 2021, we see that this disturbing neo-fascist moment united hypermasculinity, white male rage, and direct action with anti-parliamentarian and anti-democratic politics. As Eric Alterman described, quote, Trumpism's release of suppressed sexual and aggressive drives is a far cry from what Marcuse called eros. Rather, it represents what Marcuse called the political utilization of sex and aggression to reinforce social domination, end quote. That being said, this moribund marriage of opportunism with authoritarianism has not been limited in recent years to the far right. In the wake of the rise of self-described leftist streamers and anti-imperialist bloggers who claim independence from mainstream media while reproducing their brand competitiveness and associated spins on reality, many neophyte socialist celebrities have profited from, quote, preaching a contempt for democracy and parliamentarism, end quote, as revolutionary syndicalists and ultranationalists did a century ago. Along these lines, the political comedian Jimmy Dore bases his appeal in a call for the left and the right to, quote unquote, join forces against the establishment. Likewise, the Gray Zone conspiracy theorists deny the existence of concentration camps for Uyghurs and other ethno-religious minorities maintained in Xinjiang by the Chinese Communist Party. Appallingly, one of Gray Zone's main shticks is to deny Bashar al-Assad's responsibility for hundreds of chemical weapons attacks carried out against insurgents and civilian communities alike in Syria over the past decade. Rancière mentions the case of Pierre Day, a journalist who first denied the existence of labor camps in the Soviet Union in 1949, but never convinced anybody. And then he resigned from the PCF in 1974 after having engaged with Solzhenitsyn's Gulag archipelago. Like Althusser over May 1968, anti-imperialist authoritarians, who are ostensibly on the left, have built up their brands by denying the existence of the Syrian revolution over the past decade and or covering up the egregious atrocities carried out by the counter-revolutionary axis on the other, that is, Assad and his Russian and Iranian allies. With nearly 1 million Syrians murdered and millions more displaced internally and across borders, this line of gray zone and its sympathizers, of allying with the executioners, is a fundamental violation of leftist and Enlightenment principles around internationalism, humanism, and egalitarianism. In short, this anti-imperialist discourse is merely another discourse of order and a, quote, consecration of the status quo in the language of revolution, end quote. Around Syria, the Trump regime, and COVID-19, we have seen a clear convergence between Stalinists and fascists who seek to marry revolution with tradition by advancing anti-rationalism, anti-humanism, and a hatred of democracy. The risk is that contrarian bloggers and streamers in touch with these currents are implicitly and paradoxically promoting neo-Nazism by espousing, quote, an authoritarian and corporatist national revolution based on an anti-capitalist alliance, end quote. Although this risk may seem exaggerated, the experience of 4 years of Trump, plus the resentment that continues over his electoral loss, shows us just how much support the counter-enlightenment continues to enjoy. Within this struggle, in the hopes of avoiding contribution to a reinvigorated fascism in our time, anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists should restate our opposition to private property and our universal support for worker and community self-control of the economy and polity. Plus, we should revisit implicit or explicit futurism, anti-rationalism, and anti-humanism in the movement, and consider to what extent sharing a Nietzschean, Heideggerian, or Sorelian critique of liberal democracy is helpful. Furthermore, the cause of worker autonomy, which is realistically the only means of ensuring the preconditions for collective liberation and protection of the earth from climate destruction, might greatly be assisted by integrating the insights from critical theory about the psychological dimensions of overturning hierarchy, which ultimately is based on voluntary obedience into labor organizing. And I want to shout out to the panel from yesterday about critical theory and labor organizing. I was very pleased to see that. And my last line is this: I conclude, anarcho-syndicalists and critical theorists unite.
Thank you, Javier. So, Rocío Lopez, thank you very much for being here. The paper is Fascism as Bourgeois Reaction. Rocío Lopez is a writer for the International Marxist Humanist Journal. I read it all the time. Thank you very much. And a member of the Transnational Solidarity Network. An escape from reflexivity from and guidance on individualism, anxiety, and authoritarianism. Charles Thorpe, interprets the widespread support for Donald Trump among white US Americans as a combination of self-surrender and racist sadomasochism. Looking back, we must understand the roots of Trumpism. Marcuse once described Nazi Germany as a, quote, cheap gangster melodrama, end quote, a characterization that could equally be applied to Trump's administration. Still, this does not explain the deep emotional bond between the disgraced former president and the 75 million US Americans who voted to re-elect him. In this presentation, Rocío will consider Trumpism and fascism as a reactionary middle-class phenomenon. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hope you are well. Hope you can hear me. Okay. So I want to start off by talking, I'll just mention, I don't know a lot of Marcuse. The interest for this talk was doing a book club, reading a book about Fromm. It was called Eric Fromm's Critical Theory. Anyway, we'll begin. So I'll be focusing on what Fromm said about the middle class's susceptibility to fascism. So first, I want to clear up some facts about who Trump voters are. The base of Donald Trump's authoritarian movement is the middle class, or the middle income people. The median income of Trump primary and general election voters in 2016 and 2020 was much higher than the median income of either Clinton or Biden voters or Americans overall, whether they wanted it or not. So the median income of a Trump primary voter in 2016 was actually $72,000, far above, the median income in general. And as we can see, as we've seen these last couple months, the profiles of those indicted for their participation in the January 6th insurrection serve as a good reminder that Trump voters are hardly all or even mostly salt of the earth types. We've seen lawyers, real estate agents, police officers have been indicted for their participation in that coup attempt. And I just wanted to first start off with the popular narrative that Trump voters were disproportionately poor whites really doesn't have that much data behind it. White voters without a college degree making less than the median income made up only 25% of Trump's 2016 general election voters. In fact, 2/3 of Trump voters in the 2016 general election made above the median income. So let me repeat that. 2/3 of Trump voters in the 2016 general election made above the median income, so the top half. So they're disproportionately upper, middle class. So what is behind this? Why, if there's a lot of talk of economic anxiety, why would, people who are doing well be the ones who are, wanting to overthrow society in a bad direction, or overthrow the government? Well, actually, I guess to maintain Trump's in power, but, overthrow democracy, when they are not actually personally suffering necessarily. So Fromm has some explanation of what is going on here and why the middle class is particularly susceptible to being authoritarian in their personality traits. It's very simple. They have something to lose. Obviously, the capitalist class, which is about them, obviously they have their interest in maintaining capitalism, but the middle class here, I'm going to define the middle class like being the petite bourgeoisie, but also the upper income parts of the working class, like the top fifth of the working class. Even though they're proletariat, they might not have that identity as a proletariat. So their identity depends on what they have, which is not much compared to, what 1% has, but they have something: property, houses, savings. So they've seen what's been going on with neoliberalism the last few decades. And what's interesting, what I've noticed, is the more precarious working class has to find other bases for their identity, since they have to rely more on their circles and collectivity for just basic survival. Since the precarious working class have very little, actually, they don't really have a lot of property, they don't have a lot of income, they don't have a lot of savings, they're not super invested in society as much as the middle class. They are more likely to know that the basis of their self-worth and identity is more than what they do not have. For example, my most recent job was working in a call center, and my identity does not depend on, my self-worth does not depend on having a shitty job, as most of the proletariat that I know, that have, they work at 7-Eleven, whatever, security guards, that's not the basis of who they are, unlike the middle class who might identify with their particular line of work. So Charles Thorpe summarized Fromm's argument pretty well as, quote, "The threat of having nothing is the threat of being nothing. It is those that have gained some crumbs in the capital system who are most anxious about maintaining their status." So Fromm says in To Have or To Be, really succinctly, if I am what I have, and if what I have is lost, who then am I? Nobody but a defeated, deflated, pathetic testimony to a wrong way of living. Because I can lose what I have, I am necessarily constantly worried that I shall lose what I have. And let me finish that. Okay. I am afraid of thieves, of economic changes, of revolutions, of sickness, of death, and I am afraid of love, of freedom, of growth, of change, of the unknown. I have become defensive, hard, suspicious, lonely, driven by the need to have more in order to be better protected. So that, to me, that really succinctly summarizes the authoritarian middle class personality, what they have to gain by it. So just the standard account of what Marxists generally say about this middle class affinity of being the base of reaction in fascism. So obviously I mentioned the petit bourgeoisie, they're independent producers between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but they identify with neither necessarily or both, but they do not necessarily see the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, as a source of their problems. They see the proletariat as much of a threat to what they do have as they see them as a potential ally. And as I mentioned before, it's not just the petit bourgeoisie that like are self-employed who necessarily identify this way. A lot of high earning skilled workers, like I don't know, like tech workers or something, may identify that way also. These groups do not have themselves have economic problems to feel threatened by the increased precariousness of life they see happening to the working class under the last few decades of neoliberalism. Now, according to Fromm, people under capitalism have existential anxiety due to their separateness from nature. Obviously, Marx would say that, I mean, he also noted that separation from nature, but Marx would say this alienation, this basic anxiety is due to alienation from being separated from the means of production and having nothing but their labor. Now, Fromm argues that the authoritarian personality wants to escape from freedom, and pretty simply turns to a father figure who overcomes the complexity of modernity and all its choices. Like I said, I don't know much about Marcuse, but I know that Fromm rejected Freudian psychoanalysis' emphasis on sexuality, unlike Marcuse. Now, one connection between Marcuse and Fromm that I found was that they thought Marx's 1844 manuscripts were very important. So this was like the young Marx. This wasn't published in English until the early 20th century. Like very important figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin did not have access to that when they were, developing their interpretation of Marxism. So the 44 manuscripts, what they're important to know is that they concern Marxist theory of alienation as central to capitalism, which really differs from Marxist-Leninism's argument that capitalism is generally a problem of distribution. Marx in those manuscripts argued that the state controlling property would not fix one of the core problems of capitalism, which was alienation and not just private property. And that, Marcuse and Fromm agreeing on this was quite in contrast to Althusser's rejection of this importance of the young Marx in the 1844 manuscripts. Now, I want to tie this back to Marcuse. Sorry, Marcuse, because I mentioned like what Fromm had to say really explained, why this is a disproportionate middle class basis for fascist movements. But Marcuse thought the U.S. working class was not necessarily going to be the revolutionary agent, to destroy capitalism or overturn it, unlike youth or the most marginalized, like a little bit proletariat. But as we can see, actually, even with the data that we have, it's not necessarily the working class, even the white working class, that is the social base for mass authoritarian Trumpism. I would love to hear what the Marcusean scholars think of like what is behind this, because I don't know much about Marcuse. Just one last thing I wanted to note. I have not read Eros and Revolution, but a key part of the Trumpist movement is, or a part of the appeal is sexual aggression, as Javier noted. And Marcuse would certainly have something to say about that. I don't know, I'm just speculating here what he said, but the middle class is perhaps the most conformist segment of capitalist society because of their social roles. Their roles in production. And clearly Trump has offered those who are ultra conformist an outlet for their sexual aggression and frustrations. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you so much for coming here.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Let's see where we are on time. We have, it's around 4 p.m. And we're going to end this session no later than 4:50 p.m. So we have a good bit of time to discuss. If it's okay, I thought maybe it would be interesting to have each of the panelists comment on what they heard from the other panelists for a moment. I'm interested in what was provoked in you by the other panels' presentations. And if that seems interesting, maybe Shon can begin. And if not, I have some things I can add in as well. But I'd like to hear a little more from how you connect riff off of what you heard from the other speakers.
It's always funny when that's asked of not only fellow scholars, but friends and also political colleagues, because we have conversations a lot. So I'm lucky to have conversations with Rocío and Javier a lot. So so there are things that resonated that we've talked about a lot in the past. And they may not necessarily be in keeping with the sort of central themes that we're talking about looking at today.
Let's not be bound by that. Yeah, let's go where we need to go.
But I mean, I think, well, so, you know, these are both maybe sort of details, but I think like any detail, they can be an interesting starting point. I think one, Javier and I have a longstanding disagreement about post-structuralists, and I have sort of more ambivalence about the Enlightenment, I suppose, in the Enlightenment tradition and the way that we should respond to it. I certainly agree. I think Sternhell's work is brilliant, and I certainly agree that the sort of like loathing of the Enlightenment was that in some ways appeared through leftist currents was what informed fascism. And I think it's something to be contemporary, like the contemporary hatred of the Enlightenment, if you know, it seems like some, and I think I might apply this as well to sort of loathing of parliamentarianism and loathing of kind of like popular democratic process. If that seems to be really core, and you know, we're talking about the sort of loathing of the liberal tradition, if that seems like a core motive for someone politically, I'm suspicious because of that fascist heritage, and because I mean, I think after reading Sternhell's work myself, I think I could sort of, in some weird way, say it'd be hard to beat fascism at the game of anti-liberalism. And so it's one thing if one is if one is Sorel and one is motivated by anti-liberalism, and the loathings of the shortcomings of the results of the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century. If it's one thing to say that in 1910 or say 1921, and it's another thing to say that in 2021, because I think it's fair to recognize that that, you know, I mean, particularly in the wake of World War I, the horrors towards which the Enlightenment tradition might tend were vivid, and I can really understand people who took issue with that. But after fascism, it worries me that people wouldn't hesitate in that. But I do also find a lot of, obviously, Charles Mill's work about the, I think Charles Mill is a really productive thinker for engaging this, because it's both sort of like not coincidental. He helps us think through this conundrum that not coincidental. It wasn't coincidental that the constitution of racial hierarchies coexisted with the constitution of liberal democracies, and at the same time, it's kind of given us the vocabulary for attacking that hypocrisy. So I think there's a deeper, like, conundrum within a radical critique of liberalism that again, I think leaves us in a sort of ambivalence. I think I tend to be more critical of the German idealist tradition, and with the direct sort of unabated Enlightenment tradition. And I'm a personally fan of Nietzsche and Foucault, for example, and Javier doesn't. One thing that I thought was interesting in this, I found Sorel's work very helpful in my own research about violence. I love Sternhell's analysis, but I think it's really important, and I'm not sure that Javier and I agree on the small point that may have consequences. I don't feel like, I think Sorel, I definitely agree with Sternhell that Sorel created this kind of opportunity for fascism in divorcing populist violence and rage against the bourgeoisie from attacking property relations that create them, right? So I agree very much with that, with what he calls the revision of Marx in the context of when the working class hardly seemed revolutionary, like was kind of looking for a way to continue revolution. I don't think that I read Sorel as actually making the jump to ultranationalism, because he he was careful to publicly disavow and distance himself from, he was around when the ultranationalists, the French ultranationalists, the Cercle Prud'homme, had this enthusiastic uptake of his work. And he certainly didn't oppose it, but he also was careful to distance himself from it. So I don't think that in Sorel, again, this may just be nitpicky details, but I don't think Sorel himself made the jump to substituting nation for class. I think he made that possible, but I think there's an ambivalence in the legacy of Sorel. I certainly think we need to, Sorelian currents reoccur so much still within the left that we need to really foster a critical suspicion of that because of where it can go. But I also think it's important for that reason to think really carefully about those step-by-step motions. And I'm not sure that Sorel, I think the substitution of, I think the move to ultranationalism in brief, I think was somebody else. And I think I guess I don't want to lose the question that I have, which is, to what degree was that inherent in the Sorelian romanticization of violence, which again, as I was saying in my talk, is kind of reoccurs in Mao. And to what extent is fascism inherent in that moment, and to what extent can you not really call something proto-fascist until that nationalistic uptake, until there's a substitution of a different subject for the sort of evaporated working class? Because I think of that as, that's a question that bothers me quite a bit, and I don't think I think there's more space in and you can see that space in Sorel. I think the first thing that comes to mind in responding to Rocío's work is the conformism of the conformism of the middle class, and as much as I think actually what I really liked about Rocío's talk was, as much as in some senses in the US we don't talk about having as clear cut of a class sort of cultural expression as compared to, say, for example, in the UK or something. I think Rocío is zooming in on some really clear-cut things where you really can see sort of generative class relations appear through behavior in the US. And especially, I think it really rings true about the sort of whether one identifies with one's career, or you're like, I'm not like a call center person. It's not like, I think that's a really formative distinction in the way that middle class people, it's like you go to a party and somebody's like, so what do you do? And you're like, oh, why are you asking me this? And I think, so I'm really preoccupied lately with the shortcomings, as I presented in my talk. I'm really preoccupied with the limitations and shortcomings of the contemporary American left, mainly, honestly, because we have this like opportunity like we've never had before in the last decade. And our limitations, I really am frustrated that our limitations seem to be preventing us from taking full, from making full use of that. It's our limitations are more visible than the opportunity from where I sit. And I think thinking about the class character of aspects of the left, using the characteristics that Rocío was introducing, I think like I'm very bothered that a lot of, for example, anti-racism, I think has, for merely extremely contingent reasons, become expressed in an extremely middle class way. Like I talked about this self-confession habit around white privilege that we've inherited from the Cultural Revolution. I think that kind of willingness to abase yourself for progress, and also the tetchiness around language. I mean, I'm a discourse analyst. I recognize that power dwells in language completely, but at the same time, this excitement about finding new ways to talk, and like then the sort of Cultural Revolution habit of tearing people apart for using yesterday's vocabulary is extremely, extremely middle class because of that conformism that Rocío was talking about. And because it's sort of like from the conservatism of middle class and this of middle classness and this preoccupation with preserving one's holding often weaponizes, cultural linguistic habits to to perform that distinction in Bourdieu's, ideas that the distance one is from those dirty, normal working people. So I think it's interesting because Rocío's analysis was really talking about this class characteristics as they appear in Trumpian manifestations, but I think they're also extremely useful tools for thinking about the shortcomings of our own movement. And with that, did I take up half our remaining time? I will turn it over to my remaining panelists and audience. Thank you.
So thank you. Let me just drop two little footnotes, and then I'll pass the baton over to Javier. One is there's an online memorial for Charles Mills tomorrow, which you will easily be able to find by Google. And if you can't, email me and I'll give you the link. Because as you know, he just recently, just a few days ago, passed away. And so we're very sad about that. Please read The Racial Contract if you haven't read it. It's a really important book. My second footnote is that, I'm sure you're familiar with Jonathan Israel's concept of the radical enlightenment, traced back to Spinoza. And it might be one way out of this impasse that Shon is talking about is for us to acknowledge when we talk about the Enlightenment, the contradictory traditions within it. That might be a way for us to approach it differently. And I think, I don't think Jonathan Israel's a Marxist or an anarchist, but I think his concept is a really helpful one, at least it has been for me. So let me pass it over to Javier.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. Let me see. Certain things I was thinking about with Shon's presentation. Well, definitely the quote that you started out with about the weather underground is extremely telling in terms of this kind of revolutionary catastrophism, like the worse the better kind of logic, which I think is very much still in operation. When we think about people on the left, kind of defending Trump almost, like their main target is liberalism, as we've said, the Democratic Party, what Biden is doing, et cetera, which is not at all to defend the liberal Democratic Party and stuff like that from a blind perspective, but rather, it's quite. We can see the truth of who they are and the alignment with past histories that we're trying to bring to the fore today, which that's nothing more to say that it's a very disturbing situation. Let me see here. Definitely, I don't know Chinese history very well, but I do understand that Hoxha, I don't think I'm pronouncing it right, was basically, Mao's only ally after the Sino-Soviet split, which had to do with Khrushchev's 1956 speech denouncing Stalin's crimes. And so the fact that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, responded to that by saying that, Khrushchev is a revisionist and what we need to do is continue the struggle and so on. I definitely see this kind of line continuing on the left now. So I think that maybe what we can think of the purpose of this panel to a certain extent is trying to illuminate some of those continuities and trying to see how we can address them. And yeah, absolutely, I totally agree with you, Shon, about the final point you were making about, in the Middle East with your documentary, which I haven't seen, by the way. You should send it to me. I don't know if it's ready or anything, but anyway, definitely the point about, the substitution for geopolitics in place of class struggle geopolitics is extremely noxious. And I think it definitely deviates the struggle away from any kind of emancipatory outcome, which we have seen at least the glimmers of those in popular uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, especially in Syria. But of course, these uprisings have been crushed. Okay, for Rocío, so yeah, definitely, I can see what you're talking about in terms of the unclear alignment of the middle class between allying or loyalty to the bourgeoisie versus loyalty or connection with the working class. And I think also that I mean, I definitely can see the point you're making about the middle class being the most conformist. If I think, in my work history and, the different positions that have been where I've worked, of course, the managers are always the most conformist, and they're typically middle class in their origins. What else? Definitely, I mean, yeah, I think it's important to note that Trump's, I really appreciate the class analysis of Trump supporters, because I think that's been very clear that there has been an idea that it's been white people in general supporting Trump, which I think is true, but the main supporters are the ones who are upper middle class. That's quite important.
Okay, thank you. Rocío?
Yeah, it was great to hear Javier and Shon's talks. What was interesting, what I took away from Javier's talk was his contrasting Althusser's rejection of the 1968 protests in France as the students and the workers as petite bourgeoisie, and versus like obviously Marcuse was called the father of the new left, where he saw the revolutionary potential of the the youth, but also just all of that. And then I was really fascinated by Shon talking about like the continuing influence of the Cultural Revolution in the Western left. Especially, he noted that, because of like the attitude of like stick it to your enemies, whatever, do what you gotta do. That's why he caught on, but actually that it wasn't actually like organic grassroots. It was actually state sponsored, which is fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. That's a lie. That reminds me of Trumpism a little bit, where it's like, oh, stick it to people, be aggressive, fight people, but it's like the man telling you to do it. It's not coming from the downtrodden. One thing I wanted to note about something that I think Javier was just talking about, I think, was in the Middle East. So I have several. I'm lucky to have like various socialist comrades from Middle Eastern that come from the Middle East, and something that I've noticed they told me is that like the communists that exist, or even just the socialists that exist like in the Middle East, because it's so repressive, really the only like the big tendencies in the Middle East in like socialism and communism are just straight up old school Stalinists, like Communist Party, like 30s. They just, because of the vicious repressiveness of everything that's happened in most Middle Eastern societies, they're just like, they just didn't like organically develop like all the tendencies that happened in like the rest of the world, like not just the West, like the Latin America and Africa, you see like, and other parts of Asia, you see like these other tendencies that have emerged, maybe not like dominant, but like just the Stalinist tendency is very, very strong there in the Middle East. So I wonder if that has to do with like being stuck in the past, or it was like the campism is kind of stuck in that Stalinist, like, I don't know what that era was called, but like the 30s, 40s, where it was like all this campus stuff. So that's what I would say about that. It's interesting, that made me think about that they definitely mentioned that. I've actually had an encounter when I was in a meeting, and I talked about, we oppose not only US imperialism, but also, Chinese imperialism. And a gentleman, I don't know where he was from, but he's definitely Middle Eastern. He came up to me and he was very upset. He's like, how could you say China isn't, like, how could you say China is imperialist? And then a friend of mine from Lebanon came up to me after that. I was like, yeah, that's just what, there's just a lot of Stalinists in the Middle East, just didn't evolve past that point. So, yeah.
So thank you. So let me open it up to anyone else who's here in the room with comments or questions. You want
I'll
You're okay for now? Okay. So I've got a few notes, and I just wanted to share a couple of comments. First, with Rocío, I loved what you did with Fromm in the paper, and I thought your use of him in connection with middle class understanding of self was really interesting, And I was wondering if you could say more about working class understanding of self, and where is that rooted?
Sure. I haven't read a problem said that much about working class identity, but I'm just going on my observations. Yeah, like I said, just I know a little bit about the sociology of like the working class. Like I said, there's more have to depend more like on social networks and just for basic survival, and less of the just out of necessity. There's more connection like collectively in one's community. And so that's, I think, what really affects, that's like the class elements of like where the identity differs. Whereas I don't know. Yeah.
So I follow you there and I understand what you're saying. I guess what I'm wondering is if we know from your analysis what the middle class says it has to lose, what is it that the working class feels like is at stake? In other words, we see conformism in the working class too. It might be socially organized in a different way than the middle class, less individuated perhaps if we follow your social network theory. But because, if you go back to Charles Wright's old formulation, which I loved, I hope I can remember it. It's not hard to understand why the poor man strikes or why the thief steals bread. What's hard to understand is why all poor people don't steal bread and why all workers don't strike, right? And so I'm trying to get at that, and I think you've explained it for purposes of the middle class, right? But what is it that working class people feel like they have to lose that blocks their political agency, their political radicality?
When you asked that, it just made me think of like it's a double-edged sword, the pro-social thing, where I think I've just noticed, observation, working class people tend to be a lot more polite and going along. They're just much more concerned, like I was saying, the social network, with getting along with the people they're around. So I think that does limit, like, making confrontations, and like you're just so focused on like I have to please the people around me to survive. Like just like other working class people, you're really less likely to stir the pot on a lot of things. Whereas middle class people are just more likely to be rude. We can be. They're not at work, right? But like up in their social circles or whatever, just out in society, they can afford to be a little rude, or confrontational. Where the working class is just like, if you like where I'm from a ghetto, people are so polite. People who are, they're just like, gotta get along with everybody, gotta, just gotta make it through, can't stir the pot, can't get people too upset. That's like actually what I find. So they're really concerned with maintaining their social ties properly.
Let me just ask you one more kind of question connected to this. Do we know or have good evidence about what percentage of Trump voters would have voted for Bernie had Bernie been the Democratic nominee? Do we know anything about that?
I do not have that data. I don't think there's any. I'm sure it's been asked, but I don't know. I don't think I haven't seen any good evidence about that.
Well, I haven't either, and I'm very curious about that. Go ahead.
So hi, my name is Javier. I have some comments, not much by way of a question, but I think I did a presentation earlier on sort of Marcuse and Fromm, their disagreements, and touched on Marcuse Fromm debate. And I think that sort of Fromm in general is underexplored, his idea of productiveness, for instance, and his sort of psychoanalytic conceptualization of productiveness can be quite fruitful for revolutionary thought, which is something that I'm writing about in my dissertation. But interestingly, you mentioned Marx's manuscripts from 1944, and actually Fromm was one of the first people to acknowledge and recognize their importance. He wrote about it in Marx's Concept of Man, which is an interesting book that I I encourage you to explore. But more generally, there's a lot of interesting work out there on, actually from some of the panelists participating in this conference, and some that are not, but work on the from Marcuse debate and sort of kind of from's marginalization by the Frankfurt School and sort of kind of unjustly, I'll make that case. But it's, I think, given your presentation, I think if you haven't already explored the debate in various aspects of it, I think you might find that interesting. So just comments.
Yeah, thank you.
If I could comment in response to you, I love the debate between Marcuse and Fromm. I personally believe Fromm totally bested Marcuse in the debate from the 50s. And I very much sympathize with what you're saying in terms of how he was pushed out due to his, non-orthodox findings. Adorno and Horkheimer couldn't accept his revisions about the libido theory and so on. And I think, okay, he left the Frankfurt School, they kicked him out, but then he went on to do great things. So,
But interestingly, he was the one who brought psychoanalysis into the Frankfurt School in the first place.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the irony of it all.
That's what Habermas said. Yeah.
Okay, Javier, we still have some time,
Oh, yeah.
but I don't know if we're
No, yeah, for
we're at
sure.
a good ending point yet. So you decide.
I think so. I don't know what the other panelists think. Conrad, Shon, Rocío.
I wanted to open it. I know Javier asked in the chat, but I know sometimes just people feel compelled to participate in different formats. So also from the Zoom participants, if anybody had a question that you wanted to ask either in the chat or out loud or comment. This is my timekeeping device.
Could you mention again the left journal in China and spell that for us?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's Chuang. It's a really I wish. Yeah, I can't say enough good about it. We actually have it linked in the group that Javier, Rossi, and I have been in. But yeah, this is really, I think, by far and above the best. Oh, thank you. I didn't even know they came out with a book. So I posted the website. Javier posted the.
You said that to me.
Of course.
I don't have it open here.
But they're really, really. I mean, there's a number of scholars based in China, and they're only English language resource I know that really looks at, essentially from a radical left point of view that looks at the current workings of the Chinese state and capitalist class. They're really good stuff.
Okay, so thank you all very, very much.